March the 6th, 1944. 23,000 feet above Germany, the sky looked like it was on fire. Tracer lines tore through the clouds, engines screamed, and the smell of cordite hung thick inside the fuselage. The crew of our B-17 Hell's Fury fought to keep formation while flak burst like black flowers around us. They said the tail gunner's position was where men went to die, but I never believed in waiting for death. My name's Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, born and raised in South Boston. Around the docks they called me Mad Mike. I grew up in a neighborhood where you learned early that hesitation gets you hurt. My old man hauled cargo, my brother boxed golden gloves. Me? I fought anything that looked at me wrong. By 17 I'd been in more fights than I could count, and I learned one thing: hit first, think later. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, I enlisted the next morning. The recruiter wanted me in maintenance. I wanted a gun in my hands. At gunnery school they said I was too aggressive, too reckless, too eager to expose myself to enemy fire. They weren't wrong. But I told my instructor, dead gunners don't shoot back, live ones do. I graduated near the top, not because I was the best shot, but because I was the fastest. I could find a target before anyone else even spotted the glint of sunlight off its wings. They sent me to England to the 390th Bomb Group, and that's where I met Hell's Fury. She was already famous, or cursed, depending on who you asked. 3 missions, 2 close calls, and 1 tail gunner who swore the position was haunted before transferring out. I volunteered for it on the spot. Captain Whitmore, our pilot, looked at me like I was insane. "You know the stats?" he asked. "Tail gunners have the highest casualty rate. 38% don't finish their tour." I just grinned. "Then I've got 62% odds, sir. I'll take them." He shook his head and said, "You're crazy." I told him, "You'll need a little crazy back there." And that's how I got the seat no one wanted. Out there, 23,000 feet above a country that wanted us dead, I wasn't afraid. I was focused. I had 2 Browning 50s, a box of ammo, and a simple rule. If they were coming for us, I was coming for them first. That morning, I didn't know I was about to fire every one of those 2,000 rounds. I didn't know 12 German fighters would fall from the sky, or that the way we fought would never be the same again. But I can still feel the vibration of those guns through my gloves, the thunder echoing in my chest. March 6th, 1944, the day I ran out of ammunition and changed how we fought forever. Fear never had much room to grow where I came from. When a man learned to fight early, fear just became another muscle memory. You used it, or it used you. By 17, my record looked less like a life and more like a tally sheet. 32 fights, 128 punches thrown with purpose, only 4 losses. Each loss was a lesson, not a scar. The trick wasn't about being the toughest, it was about deciding first. Every man hesitates. The smart ones learn that the first move decides who's still standing when it's over. That rule became my compass. I used it everywhere, in work, in talk, in the way I looked at trouble. I never thought of myself as brave, only unwilling to wait for fate to choose for me. Boston's nights had their rhythm, the smell of salt, beer, and iron. The harbour cranes groaning like tired giants. Somewhere between those sounds, I learned how small the world feels when you've already decided to fight it. Maybe that's why I never dreamed of escape, only of motion. The docks weren't home so much as a training ground that never asked permission to make you harder. Looking back, I think that's when the line between survival and defiance blurred for good. I didn't want to be safe. I wanted to be certain. That feeling, that refusal to back off, was already shaping the man I'd become. The world was getting ready for a fight it didn't yet see coming, and so was I. If there was one thing I knew about myself, it was this. I wasn't built to wait for trouble. I was built to meet it halfway. And that, more than anything, was what would send me into the sky. Not for glory, not for country, but because losing was something I never learned how to do. When I finally left Boston, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I was walking into the next fight. The train out of South Station was packed with young men carrying new uniforms and old habits. Nobody said much. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks filled in for words. By the time we reached the training grounds, I already knew this wasn't going to be about patriotism or pride. It was about who could learn fastest before the sky started taking its payment in blood. The gunnery school sat out in the middle of nowhere. Flat land, hard wind, and the constant smell of oil and smoke. The first thing that hit you wasn't the noise but the weight of it all. The metallic air, the rattle of tools, the echo of 50 caliber burst rolling across the range like thunder. We stripped Brownings apart until our knuckles split, put them back together blindfolded, fed belts until our fingers blistered. They told us precision saves lives. I learned that speed decides who lives long enough to be precise. The instructors called me reckless, said I was too aggressive, moved too fast, risked too much exposure. "Donovan," one of them barked, "you can't lean into the fight like that. You'll get yourself killed." I told him the same thing I believed then and still do now. Dead gunners don't shoot back, live ones do. The line stuck. It followed me like a shadow for the rest of the war. My way of thinking was simple. If you wait for the perfect moment, you've already given it away. I didn't wait for the enemy to enter my sights. I hunted them before they knew they were being watched. I learned to read movement faster than others, the blink of sunlight off a canopy, the sudden shimmer in the clouds, the twitch that meant someone was diving toward you. Sometimes I fired before anyone else even saw what I was aiming at. Sometimes I missed, but not often. They started calling me Trigger Donovan. I wasn't the best shot, but I was the first one ready. By the time graduation came, I'd stopped thinking like a student and started thinking like a survivor. They posted our orders on the wall the next morning. 390th Bombardment Group, Framlingham, England. Some cheered, some went quiet. I just folded the paper, put it in my pocket and thought, time to see if I was right. Orders in hand, I boarded the transport out of gunnery school with the smell of oil still clinging to my jacket. England felt less like a destination and more like a test waiting for its subject. The flight over the Atlantic was long, grey and cold. Time enough to think about whether the training range had taught me enough to stay alive when the target started shooting back. When we finally landed in Framlingham, the airfield looked like it had been carved out of mud and fog. Rows of B-17s lined the runway like sleeping beasts, their tails jutting up through the mist. One of them bore a name painted in red letters that seemed more like a warning than pride. Hell's Fury. I met her before I met the crew. She wasn't a machine that comforted you. She was a living, breathing chunk of metal that growled when you touched her. A B-17 with skin like hammered iron and a temper to match. The floor vibrated under your boots, cables hummed in the ribs, and the smell of fuel was so thick it could coat your tongue. Inside, you learned where courage ended and noise began. Captain James Whitmore commanded her. Calm, sharp, the kind of man who saved words for when they mattered. The rest of the crew felt like pieces of one machine. Murphy the crew chief, hands black with grease. Tommy Price and Carl Johnson guarding the waist guns. The navigator drawing the sky and pencil lines, and the radio operator keeping a heartbeat of static alive. Before me, a gunner named Eddie Morrison had the tail. He'd survived 2 missions that should have killed him and went straight to command to transfer out. Said the position was cursed, said something about that seat felt wrong, too quiet before the attacks, too loud after. The men called it superstition. I called it a challenge. I volunteered before I even thought it through. Whitmore looked at me for a long time, the kind of look that measured a man more than his words. "You know the stats?" he asked, a voice steady as an engine. "Tail gunners have the highest casualty rate. 38% don't finish their tour." I shrugged. "Then I've got 62% odds, sir. I'll take them." He frowned like he was trying to decide if I was fearless or just stupid. "You're crazy," he said at last. I smiled. "Then you'll need me back there." He called me crazy again, but he gave me the seat. March 2nd, 1944, Schweinfurt. The name alone made every man tighten his harness a little harder. Ball-bearing factories deep in Germany, thick with flak and crawling with fighters. It was the kind of mission where no one expected an easy way back. Hell's Fury rolled down the runway before dawn, engines roaring like a pack of angry beasts. I sat in the tail, the world shrinking to my gun sight and the steady heartbeat of twin 50s waiting to wake up. At 23,000 feet, the cold turned breath into glass. Sunlight glinted off the frost that clung to the fuselage, and below us Germany looked peaceful, the way a shark looks calm before it moves. The first bandits appeared just past the target zone, Me-109s in tight formation, coming in high and organised, confident. Standard procedure said to wait until they committed to the attack, then fire, but standard procedure had never been in this seat. I saw them form up and didn't wait for anyone's permission. I opened up early, a long burst across the sky, tracers arching like angry comets. The Germans broke formation instantly. Some peeled off, others wavered. Their perfect geometry shattered before it ever reached us. It wasn't about hitting them, it was about hitting their nerve. Every burst forced them to recalculate, to doubt their own timing. By the time they regrouped, the bomb run was done, and we were already turning home. When we landed back at Framlingham, the ground crew counted holes and scratches, less than usual. Murphy, our crew chief, climbed up to the tail, grease on his face and disbelief in his eyes. 1,600 rounds for one mission, Mike, he said, shaking his head. You burned through 80% of your ammo. I unbuckled, still half deaf from the guns. And nobody died, I said. I call that saving lives. He stared at me for a second, then laughed in that way mechanics do when they're not sure if they're dealing with genius or madness. You're out of your mind, he said. Maybe I was, but I knew one thing. The Germans hadn't gotten close enough to prove him wrong. That night, as I cleaned the guns, I realized the lesson. Fear works both ways. If I could make them blink first, they'd never see me as prey again. That was the night Mad Mike stopped being a nickname and started being a method. They came out of the sun like teeth. 12 of them, tight and ugly, sliding into position with the kind of confidence that says you've done this 1,000 times. March 6, 1944, over Augsburg. And for the first time that day, the air didn't feel like something we could negotiate with. It felt like something that would take what it wanted unless we took it first. I'd watched them form up at about 2,000 yards, crisp in the light, wingmen holding station like they'd been taught. The standard play was to wait for the lead to commit and then let everything pour into him. I didn't wait. I opened on the second bird, the wingman, because he was the predictable one, the one who keeps formation, not the one who thinks. A long tracered burst arced out of my twin 50s, and the effect wasn't measured hits so much as chaos. The wingman folded into flame, the lead blinked and the whole wedge hiccuped. That's the ugly math of air combat. Shake the formation's head and the rest start to stumble. I walked my tracers through the gaps where they were supposed to be tight. I fired short, nasty bursts into the centre where the formation's nerve lived, and I watched pilots I'd never met make mistakes they'd regret. I fired where a plane would be 2 seconds from now rather than where it was. Anticipation more than sight. And that's when the real kills came. A canopy shattering, an engine coughing black, a wing folding like paper. In 60 seconds we'd taken 3. In the next minute 3 more went out in smoke. Everything moved faster than thought. Target, lead, correction, fire, and there was no room for second guesses. The tracers made ugly flowers in the sky, and twice I saw metal strike metal as frightened men tried to evade each other. Collisions answered some of my shots. I didn't have the luxury of careful aiming. I had the task of making them quit trying. By the time it had been 4 minutes, the tally was brutal and simple. 12 BF-109s no longer answering the sky. My belts were lighter, and the tail section smelled like burnt powder and hot metal, but the bomber behind me hadn't taken a fatal strike. I don't remember thinking much about surviving in those seconds. There wasn't time for that. I remember deciding. I remember the cold arithmetic of it. If they had a plan, I would disrupt it. If they had courage, I would make them trade it for metal in the sky. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to make sure none of us got one last stupid chance to be hit. I didn't think I was surviving so much as forcing survival. Don't give them the chance to live. After 2 attack runs, the sky turned against us. Hell's Fury had drifted off formation. No escorts, no nearby bombers, just one wounded fortress flying alone through enemy country. The radio crackled with broken calls from other crews, voices fading into static. Then radar picked up movement, too much movement. 48 fighters, BF-109s and FW-190s, forming up in the distance, a whole storm of wings gathering to erase us from the map. There wasn't time for fear, there was only math. 12 guns, 2,000 rounds, 1 chance. If we wait, we die, I said over the intercom. If we move first, maybe we make them think twice. Whitmore didn't argue. He just said, do it. The fighters were still forming, lines tightening like a noose. I didn't wait for them to dive. I opened fire into the empty air, straight into the space where coordination lived. 8 seconds of sustained fire, tracers tearing through the sky like lightning. I wasn't aiming for planes, I was aiming for their minds. The formation shattered. 2 German fighters tried to break the same direction and collided mid-air, a flash of orange and silver tumbling through the clouds. The rest scattered like a flock hit by thunder. For a moment the sky turned into chaos. Shrapnel, smoke, metal shards spinning past the tail. The roar of engines mixed with the howl of wind through torn fuselage panels. The whole world felt like it was coming apart, and the only thing keeping it together was the rhythm of the guns. I could hear every casing hit the deck behind me, every link of the ammo belt rattling through the feed. "Christ, Mike, what are you firing at?" the waist gunner shouted. "Fear," I said, and kept firing. In those 8 seconds, I wasn't thinking about accuracy. I was thinking about control. I could feel the fear ripple through them. You could almost see it in the way the remaining fighters stopped moving like a unit and started moving like individuals. Their timing broke, their nerve broke. The formation that had looked like an unstoppable wall was now a scatter of confused dots, each one fighting not for victory but for distance. The sky was full of metal and fire and screaming wind, but inside that noise I found calm. 8 seconds. I didn't shoot at planes. I shot at their fear. When the last belt clicked empty, I felt it more as a change in rhythm than a catastrophe. 2,000 rounds gone, metal warm under my palms, the tail suddenly as quiet as a grave. We'd seen 21 of their fighters go down already. Radar in the sky agreed there were 27 left circling out beyond the smoke. That should have been the moment the math ate us. 1 bomber, 1 tail position with no ammo, and dozens of fighters with fresh rounds. Instead, something else did the work for me. I kept my hands moving as if the feed was still sliding through. I swept the sights, I tracked their lines, I walked empty barrels like they were loaded. The motion had a voice. Pilots see intent the way dogs read posture. 1 lead fighter tightened to break our tail and I kept the gun steady, the barrels following his silhouette though nothing came out. He saw the barrels track him, felt the rhythm and he broke off. Another followed his lead, then another, until what had been an organised strike dissolved into small jittering escapes. They weren't reacting to me in the present. They were reacting to what they had learned in the last 10 minutes. They weren't afraid of the metal in my hands. They were afraid of the lesson burned into their heads, that this plane had teeth. I could hear the crew moving behind me, voices thin, checking armour, calling damage reports. The navigator's map had more blacked out patches than I wanted to read. The bull turret had taken hits, and a hydraulic line bled where flak had nicked a rib, but nothing that kept us from flying. Whitmore flew like he had one job and 1,000 reasons not to fail. His hands were steady, his voice small and exact. We limped away on fragments of luck and the stubborn physics of wings. The Germans made one last pass precise and cruel, but they kept their distance where they would have come in close before. They circled, probed, and then, as if admitting something, turned away. When the English coastline reappeared under our wings, the plane looked more like a shell than a ship. Patched skin, soot, a rhythm of damage that spoke of close calls. Down on the field, the boys climbed out quiet, hands that had been white on controls now shaking with relief. Hell's fury came down like a piece of something that had almost been killed and somehow remembered how to breathe. I sat on that tail ladder and felt the world like it had been rewritten. We were alive because for a little while we had made them trade order for fear. They didn't fear me, they feared the memory of me. When we rolled to a stop and the ground crew climbed into the tail to count casings, the sight of emptied belts was ridiculous and terrible all at once. 2,000 rounds gone, boxes tapped out, everything starting and ending with a hollow clink. They ran the numbers like accountants. 12 confirmed Bf 109s, 4 probables, 3 damaged. The sort of tally you don't expect to find on your own watch. Murphy put his greasy hand on my shoulder and just laughed once, a hard, short sound that meant he didn't know whether to be proud or afraid. Word moved faster than the paperwork. By the time I'd brushed the soot off my gloves, a corporal was tapping me on the shoulder. "Sergeant Donovan, HQ wants you in debrief." I walked in thinking they'd want to know how the flak hit us. Not that one gunner had turned a raid into a cautionary tale. Major General Anderson was there in plain uniform, not a parade brass in sight. The kind of man whose eyes measured a man's worth the way a mechanic measures a crankshaft. He sat down and didn't waste the small talk. "You changed something out there," he said. "Can you teach it?" I answered to the point. Only to the ones who don't fear attacking. He smiled like a man who'd heard the right kind of trouble. Then you'll teach them, he said. And the next week I was reassigned out of the crew and into training. That's where the doctrine began to take shape. Not as poetry, but as 5 simple, brutal lessons we could drill into another man's hands and nerves. First, seize the initiative. Don't let the attacker pick the moment. Force the fight on your terms. Second, psychological effect matters as much as metal. The first burst needn't kill so much as break a formation's nerve. Third, focus fire. When outnumbered, concentrate on the single most dangerous sector rather than splitting attention across many threats. Fourth, ammunition economy through aggression. A bold early shot can cost fewer rounds than a long defensive trade that wastes belts and time. Fifth, accept and manage risk. Aggressive defense raises individual exposure but lowers mission losses. You select and harden the men who can make that trade. We practiced those points until they were muscle memory. Drills that taught the eye to pick the wingman, the finger to squeeze a split second earlier, the mind to hold calm in a stall of chaos. Some called me mad, others dangerous. Some laughed at the idea teaching guys to shoot before they were shot at. But when those men took their first missions wearing the new habit, the odds shifted. The name Donovan Doctrine floated around HQ memos and training sheets after that. A short, ugly line that meant a single gunner could change a fight before it began. I didn't think of myself as a genius. I thought of it as a ledger. Lives saved versus rounds fired. The math, oddly enough, looked like survival. After the war, the noise stopped, but the silence never did. I went back to Boston, traded gun oil for concrete dust, the hum of engines for the thud of hammers. People said men like me couldn't go back to ordinary life. They were half right. I worked construction for 16 years, building walls instead of breaking them, carrying steel instead of guns. Nobody ever asked what I did in the war, and I never offered to tell. Maybe I was afraid the words would sound too small for what they'd meant back then. They called me a hero once. I called myself a man who was scared enough to shoot first. The medals went into a drawer, the stories stayed buried under the noise of city streets. When I died, they said the service was quiet. No honor guard, no 21-gun salute, just family, a priest who didn't know the story, and a few old gunners who did. I suppose that was fitting. You spend a life fighting not to be killed, and when you finally rest, the quiet feels earned. People talk about glory and courage, but that was never the truth of it. The truth was fear, the kind that sharpens your hands and clears your head, the kind that makes you move before you think. I remembered the numbers sometimes. 12 German fighters down in 4 minutes, 300 gunners trained, 3,000 men who made it home because they learned to shoot first. They were the real story. I was just the messenger who happened to survive long enough to deliver it. The war taught me that courage isn't loud and victory isn't permanent. It's a series of small delays, of making death wait 1 more minute, 1 more mission, 1 more man home alive. When people say I changed air combat, I shake my head. I didn't change the war. I just made death hesitate long enough for my friends to get home.